Hello, I am Dr. David Santos. Hello, I am Dr. David Santos. We are continuing on in our study in pagan myths and religions. We've moved into the classical period now. So from now on, you're going to be hearing the classical pagan myths and religions. We've finished up a course of 10 lectures on the ancient pagan myths and religions. And this gives us an opportunity to revisit some issues that we didn't get to touch on regarding creation and creationism and how the classical world really viewed stories of creation, how they looked at myth and mythology, how they looked at religion. And we're going to see how religions, these ancient and classical religions, transform from, they kind of have their own renaissance in this period during the classical era. And the renaissance is moving from what they might call a superstitious understanding into a more reasoned understanding of mythology and religion. And they're going to have these conflicts within the classical world of really figuring out what they have to believe and trying to blend in their traditions with what is yet to come and what their new philosophies are. So the classical world, when we talk about that period, it's going to vary depending on who you talk to and how they're defining it. So what we're really talking about here is the Greco-Roman world. So some people in that, they don't include necessarily the Hellenistic period. So they'll kind of mark a period where Alexander the Great dies and moving on from there. And that's becomes less the classical world. I think most people define it in, I have a master's degree in classical Mediterranean, and we'd typically define it from about 600 BC to 600 AD. Some people might shrink that down a little bit. A few people will broaden it up a little bit. That's a pretty good figure for us to use as we go forward here. So as we introduce you to this topic, we're going to look at a few things. We're looking at the intersection of myth, philosophy, and religion. And throughout history, cultures have really sought to explain the origins of the universe, humanity, and the divine order through creation myths. These narratives often deeply embedded in religious traditions, and they serve to answer fundamental questions about our existence, our purpose, who we are, what we're made of, and the nature of the cosmos. Problem is, as intellectual traditions evolved, especially in the classical period, a philosophical turn emerges, and they start to seek these rationalized, systematized understandings of these myths using principles of logic. As they do so, they add in causality and they add in metaphysics. So this period sees an increasing synthesis of mythology, philosophy, and theology shaping the foundations of beliefs of the Western and European traditions. This philosophical turn in creation myths is one that's important for us to study and understand. And while early myths relied on divine action and anthropomorphic deities to explain cosmic origins, classical thinkers sought these underlying principles or abstract causes that governed existence rather than the divine. This intellectual shift did not necessarily replace myth, but what it does, it's a new method of interpreting and integrating it into philosophical discourse. A good example of this is Plato's Demiurge. It's a rational and benevolent creator, recast Greek cosmology, and places it in a philosophical framework. And at the same time, or same kind of thinking as Philo of Alexandria sought to merge Jewish theology with Greek metaphysics. And classical influences on theology and discourse can be seen in this period. So we see Greek rationalism, so Plato's forms, and Aristotelian causality. So Plato's forms, that's something very important to us to understand. When he talks about forms, you're going to hear this a lot if you get into the study of philosophy. The forms are something that is perfect. I've talked about this when I've taught church history and some other things, that Plato's form really has a great application for us when we're studying the Gospel of John, the first 3 verses of it. Forms are something that are perfect. That's why they're called forms, because we can't actually achieve anything in perfection. One of the examples I remember from undergraduate philosophy classes, a perfect circle. So we may get really close, whether we're drawing a perfect circle or making a coin that is as perfect as possible. But at the end of the day, it still has not reached perfection. There's going to be tiny little imperfections that make it not quite perfect. So this idea of a form or a perfection can only be in our mind. It can only be thought of. It's the word. It's the thought. It's the thing that is unreachable. It's out there. It's understandable. We can conceive of it. We can in part perceive it, but it's out there and we can't quite get there. So it's something only that the divine can achieve. So really has great application when we start to think about Jesus as the Logos, relating, I think, this idea of forms and the perfection, the thing that's out there that's completely perfect that we can't achieve, and that only that divine being can fully achieve this. So that's the idea of Plato's forms. Aristotle brings in this idea of cause and effect. Let's look at some more specifics here. Plato's Timaeus presents a rational creator who orders the cosmos using these eternal forms that we just talked about, and replaces earlier accounts of the chaotic primordial forces. Aristotle introduces the concept of cause, aetion, distinguishing between material, formal, efficient, and final causes, and it providing a systematic explanation of existence beyond mythical narratives. Greek philosophers preserved elements of mythology, often interpreting myths allegorically to convey deeper metaphysical truths. This is going to be one of those things that Philo introduces. Philo has this whole system of interpreting the Old Testament based on an allegorical method. This will creep its way into the Christian church early on, especially through guys like Origen, who are going to grab onto this concept and bring allegorical interpretation, allegory, that's what I meant to say. But the allegoric interpretation, adding allegory to things that are not meant to convey that kind of message. And he does this especially in places like the book of Genesis. So this is going to open a lot of doors for misinterpreting the Bible very, very early on. We see within this time period Roman adaptations, especially making them very poetic. Ovid blending mythology with philosophy. Some others are going to do that too. Ovid's Metamorphosis transform Hesiod's cosmogony into a poetic account of creation, reflecting influences from Stoic providence and Epicurean materialism. So we have another guy, Lucretius. He writes the De Rerum Natura, and it rejects divine intervention, presenting atoms and natural law as true forces behind cosmic formation. He's not putting it in that terms, but he's got an idea of something that we can't see. And Romans often preserved religious tradition while engaging in philosophical skepticism, using myth as a didactic and cultural tool rather than an absolute explanation of origins. So you can see what they've done. They want to maintain their religion and continue to participate in that, and continue to have these traditional religious mechanisms for order, and yet they want to question them at the same time. And you could do that in the Roman world. And but you had traditionalists, especially as you're moving from the Roman Republic into the empire. That transitional period, you see some trying to rein things back into traditions. Augustus was one of those. He portrayed himself, at least, as a traditionalist, reining things in, keeping order, even though if you looked very closely at how he lived and the things that he did, he was not much of a traditionalist at all. But that's how he portrayed himself. So this Jewish Hellenistic synthesis by Philo's reinterpretation of Genesis is one we need to understand. Philo of Alexandria sought to harmonize Genesis with Greek philosophy, interpreting the logos, or the word, as divine agent of creation. His Stoic and Platonic influences led him to see God as the source of rational order, with creation unfolding through divine reason rather than anthropomorphic intervention. So his synthesis really influenced early Christian theology, especially the more Gnostic-leaning types that are studying John 1 through 3, presents Christ as the incarnate Logos through whom creation came into being. So our conclusion to this piece of our puzzle is that the legacy of philosophical creation myths. The classical period witnessed this dynamic fusion of myth, philosophy, and theology, and it shapes subsequent religious traditions. Greek rationalism provided an abstract principles. Roman poetry preserved myth while engaging with naturalistic explanations. Jewish Hellenistic thought laid the groundwork for later theological developments. These influences continued to shape modern interpretations of creation, demonstrating the enduring dialogue between faith and reason. Let's look a little deeper at the Greek philosophical creation myths themselves, where Plato's Timaeus and Hesiod's Theogony play an important part. The evolution of Greek cosmogony reveals a shift from mythological narratives rooted in divine succession, like the Theogony, to philosophical models that emphasize rational causation and metaphysical principles. That's Timaeus. Plato's Timaeus was written about 360 BC. It stands out as the most sophisticated philosophical treatment of creation, proposing that a rational craftsman imposed order on pre-existing chaotic matter. Much like the term that we use today, intelligent design, which if you get away from God, who's replaced God in intelligent design? Aliens, or some other being, or even, well, there's wilder things. I'll just leave it at that. And then there's simplified naturalistic ideas surrounding intelligent design. This contrasts with Hesiod's Theogony from 700 BC, where chaos is the primordial entity that bursts the cosmos through this genealogical succession of deities. Plato's Timaeus provides a rational teleological explanation for the origins of the cosmos, replacing the mythic struggles of deities with systematic ordering principles. We see this divine craftsman. Unlike Hesiod's primordial deities, Plato's version is a rational, benevolent being. He works with pre-existing chaos, bringing it into mathematical and moral order. He brings it into alignment with these eternal forms, and Plato explicitly contrasts his account with traditional mythical versions, suggesting that myths obscure truth with poetic embellishments where philosophy seeks logical coherence. So here's a little excerpt for you from Plato's Timaeus. Quote, God desired that all things should be good and nothing bad, so far as possible. Wherefore, finding the whole visible sphere not at rest, but in discordant and disorderly motion, he brought it into order. He was good. And in the good, no jealousy can ever arise about anything whatever. And being free from jealousy, he desired that all things should be like himself as far as possible. End quote. So the role of eternal forms in structuring the material world. Plato introduces forms as this eternal, perfect archetypes that the Demiurge imitates in shaping the physical world. The material world is a mere reflection of these forms, and it is imperfection arises from its association with fluctuating realm of matter. So the cosmos itself is animated by a world soul, ensuring its harmony and its natural intelligence. Here's another reading, quote, wherefore, using the language of probability, we may say that the world became a living creature truly endowed with soul and intelligence by the providence of God. Remember, guys, we're not doing theology when we look at this. We're going to see how it impacts theology, but we're doing history, and we're studying. This is what they think, and remember, this is the pagan world trying to come up with answers all on their own. So it's put it in that perspective, and let's look at the influence on later Neoplatonic and Christian thought. Plato's concept of the logos, meaning rational order, laid the groundwork for Hellenistic Judaism, so Philo of Alexandria, and early Christian theology. Philo synthesized Plato's logos with the biblical account of creation, proposing that the logos was the instrument of divine creation. Kind of had some things right here. But even on things he gets kind of close to, he still misses. It's like watching Ancient Aliens, which I mentioned aliens before, mentioned again. They get so close, and they look at all these different things, and then as they're going, there must be something out there, and so these divine, nearly divine things, and then they're 1 second away from saying, and it must be God, and then they go alien. Really? You were, guys, you're that close, and you missed it. The heavens do declare the glory of God. Just some people would rather see other stuff there. The Gospel of John directly borrows from these Platonic ideas and the Philonic framework, identifying Christ as the divine logos. Now, so this is how scholars think, and how we typically explain these things. I do tend to always want to flip that around, though, because the reality is for whatever truth these guys find, they're finding the truth of the God of creation and the God of natural law. So they're observing natural law. In the case of Philo, he's observing Old Testament scripture and thinking about the natural order of things, and they're making conclusions that are close to right. And they're seeing the idea of the Logos come about, and therefore the Holy Spirit inspires these words to put it in a fashion that would be incredibly impactful to a specific culture. So keep that in mind, put it in right perspective. Here's, in the beginning was the Word, Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. That's the true story. So let's relate this to Hesiod's Theogony. While Plato's account is philosophical and teleological, Hesiod's early cosmogony is genealogical, tracing the descent of primordial beings through divine succession. Hesiod's chaos as the primordial force. In Hesiod's Theogony, chaos is the first principle from which arise Gaia, earth, Tartarus, underworld, has deeper meaning, get it, deeper meaning than underworld, but Eros, desire, the principle of let's just put in generative force so it can generate things. Rather than a rational creator imposing order, the universe evolves through divine conflict, culminating in Zeus's establishment of cosmic rule. Here's a piece from Hesiod's Theogony, quote, "Verily, at first chaos came to be, but next, wise Bosmed Gia, ever secure foundation of all the deathless ones who hold the peaks of snowy Olympus, and dim Tartarus in the depths of the earth, and Eros, fairest among the immortal gods." All right, let's move to this philosophical shift from anthropomorphic gods to abstract principles. Trulia, he's a historian in 2018, argues that Hesiod's chaos is not merely disorder, but a void, a proto-metaphysical concept of emptiness. While Wheeler notes that 1995 notes that Plato's Demiurge intellectualizes cosmogony, shifting from divine genealogies to abstract rational causes. So he's making creation smarter is the idea behind the scholars. So Plato rejects the notion of creation as a divine conflict, replacing it with a harmonious order of the cosmos based on mathematical proportions. So we'll do a comparison in the future here shortly of Hesiod and Ovid, and let's save that for a minute. But let's get you one more quote here from Ovid's Metamorphosis. "Before the sea and the land and the sky which covers all things, there was one face of nature in the whole world, which they called chaos, rough, unordered mass, nothing except an inert weight and a discordant seeds of things not properly joined together." So we see a void. And that void is a precondition for creation, a disordered mass needing divine intervention. So here's the way we'll conclude this section. The shift from Hesiod to Plato to Plato to Ovid marks a transformation in how Greeks understood creation. Plato's rational ideas contrast with Hesiod's chaotic succession of deities, reflecting the philosophical shift towards reason and metaphysical abstraction. These ideas laid the foundation for Platonism and Christian theology, demonstrating the enduring dialogue between mythology, philosophy, and theology. Okay, let's take a look at this way of comparing Hesiod's theogony to Ovid's metamorphosis. In terms of chaos, Hesiod has a void, which is precondition for creation, versus Ovid, a disordered mass needing divine intervention. Method of creation for Hesiod's theogony, this is the earlier one, divine genealogy and conflict versus harmonization of nature in Ovid. Order versus disorder, we see a cosmic order emerge from Zeus's rule versus order imposed by an unnamed force and influence. Greek mythology and religion versus Roman poetic philosophy and Stoicism. So that's a comparison between Hesiod and Ovid. And you're seeing this transition from one way, the older traditional way of looking at things, to the newer one. And within that, a whole bunch of interesting things. It really demonstrates the rise of rationalism. And like I describe it as, this is a complete change in the way things are thinking. This is a renaissance of the classical world. This renaissance will be drawn into the era of the Renaissance and the Reformation, because this guy right here, Ovid, he's going to become very popular in that time period. And his ideas about creation are going to make their way into the church in the Reformation period, and going to find a home within certain circles in the era of the Renaissance and Reformation. Let's quickly compare Ovid to Lucretius. So in the cosmogony, we see chaos, order imposed by divine natural forces versus atoms, something small forming structures by chance. We see divine role, divine force, unnamed structures and as the reality versus no divine involvement. We see Stoicism, order in nature, Epicureanism, randomness, compared to just pure randomness. We see, it should ring a bell for us right now. Just we saw that same change here in our own world. We see religious attitudes, myths have meaning, but remember, they're making allegory out of them, versus religion is a human construct. This is always the way that things progress. View of nature is structured and purposeful, versus nature operates by chance and necessity. So let's consider a little more the Roman adaptation of Greek mythology. The Romans inherited the mythological framework of Greeks, but reinterpreted it as through a distinct lens. So they blend these poetic traditions with philosophical inquiry. Roman authors such as Ovid and Lucretius sought to reimagine cosmogony in ways that reflected their cultural, literal, and intellectual environments. Ovid's metamorphosis synthesized Greek mythological elements, like we said, it was Stoic and Epicurean thought, and it takes off from there. This took an entirely materialistic approach, and it rejects the divine intervention in favor of natural laws. Of course, what they miss in that is that the creator of natural law is the God of nature, the God over the cosmos. So they kind of miss that. Ovid's Metamorphosis provides a poetic yet philosophical retelling of the cosmos' formation. And unlike Hesiod, who described chaos as a void, Ovid envisioned it as a disordered mass. Let's read a piece of Metamorphosis here. Before the sea, the land, and the sky, which covers all, nature displayed a single face across the whole world, which they called chaos, a rough, unordered mass, nothing but an inert weight. I think actually I read that to you. Read this whole thing to you. Oh, here's the next one. The elements had been heaped together in a single heap. Hot things fought cold. Dry fought wet. Heavy fought light. Everything opposed its opposite. A god, or natural force, resolved this strife and separated them into their rightful places. So we see this personification of nature as an active force. Ovid avoids naming a single deity as the creator, instead invoking natura, nature, as the force that organizes the universe. Should just sound like Darwinism in our day. This is a shift from gods to the natural. In Metamorphosis, he also writes, thus whoever the gods it was, when nature was divided, imposed harmony upon the discordant mass, dividing the sky from the land from the waters, and setting each in its proper place. Hesiod's Theology presents the cosmogony dominated by divine generational struggle, where Zeus establishes cosmic order through conflict. Ovid, by contrast, presents creation as an act of rational separation, more aligned with Platonic thought. Here's from Lucretius, and he writes, the universe consists of atoms and empty space. Everything else is mere opinion. The world was not created by divine power, but by the natural course of matter. So very ahead of his time, but missing out. No divine intervention. Natural laws govern existence, is the idea here. And again, from Lucretius, for the nature of the universe is free and uncontrolled by the hands of God. The world does not exist for us, but rather we exist due to the endless interplay of matter. Then we have Roman religious pragmatism, gods as social constructs. Again, unlike Hesiod and Ovid, who preserved a theistic or semi-theistic cosmogony, Lucretius reduces gods to cultural constructs. So, with that, it kind of continues on from there. We see these comparisons as very relational to our situation today. Same things are taking place. There's nothing new under the sun. So we see Ovid and Lucretius kind of as two ends of the Roman intellectual spectrum, like bookends. One preserving myth while adapting to philosophy, the other rejecting divine causation in favor of scientific materialism. Always goes this direction. This is the way things go. Let's take a quick look at Indian philosophical creation. These accounts. We begin with the Upanishads and their Greek parallels, and this is 800 to 200 BC. forming the core of the Vedantic philosophy, offering a metaphysical perspective on creation that diverges from Greek teleology and divine interventionism instead of a personal creator. And they propose Brahman, an unchanging, eternal, ultimate reality from which all existence emerges and into which it dissolves. So we have a framework that rejects dualism and posits illusion in its place as a root of perceived diversity. The Greek and Indian traditions converge on certain metaphysical principles, especially in Plato's forms and Neoplatonic thought, where being is ultimate and beyond material reality. The Upanishadic view of creation is that Brahman was the ultimate reality from which everything emerges, and in contrast to Greek ideas of genealogical cosmology, so God's having these generations, so they're moving away from that. So from one of these Indian sources we read, "In the beginning, my dear, this world was just being, one only, without a second. Some say that in the beginning it was just non-being, one only, without a second, and that from that non-being, being was born. But how indeed could it be so, my dear? How could being be born from non-being?" Actually, that is a really good question. It can't. "Rather, my dear, in the beginning, this world was just being, one only, without a second." So remember, they're putting that in very naturalistic terms. From there, we can see this quick comparison here. You can take a screenshot of it and take a quick look at it if you desire to. But these are the areas: ultimate reality, and comparing two different world views. When we get to the Jewish and Hellenistic synthesis of Philo of Alexandria, we see Jewish intellectual traditions emerge as a fusion of Jewish theological concepts with Greek philosophical thought, particularly Platonism and Stoicism. Philo of Alexandria, he's a Jewish philosopher writing in Greek, sought to harmonize the Hebrew Bible, especially Genesis, with Platonic metaphysics and Stoic rationalism. His most influential contribution was his doctrine of the Logos, which he described as the divine intermediary between God and creation. Interpreting Genesis through Platonic and Stoic lenses was one of his most recognized works. I'll put it that way. I was going to say greatest works, but in a way it is. He did not reject Hebrew scriptures, but sought to reinterpret them allegorically. And he's looking at them in light of Greek philosophy. He saw Genesis not as historical narrative, but as a metaphysical explanation of creation in terms of divine reason. So here's a quote from you. Quote, "Now God, not intending to fashion the world as an incorporeal form, but as something visible and tangible, created the intangible world first, just as a city builder lays out a plan before construction." That's forms. "The intelligible world is the logos, the archetype of the world perceived by the senses." So Philo draws on Plato's Timaeus, where the Demiurge creates the the world based on eternal forms. The Logos functions as the blueprint of creation, much like Plato's realm of forms. God is the supreme creator, but his creative activity is mediated through the Logos. We see the Logos, the divine word, as the intermediary between God and creation. Philo developed the concept of the Logos as a rational principle that governs the universe, like the Stoic Logos, which is material, and pervades the cosmos as divine reason. Philo's Logos is distinct from God, acting as an intermediary agent. He wrote, the Logos isn't the image of God, but whom the entire world was created, by whom the entire world was created. It is the eldest son of the uncreated Father. Also written, to his word, his chief messenger, God, gave a special prerogative, God gave a special prerogative to stand on the border and separate the created from the uncreated. The Logos is both the ambassador of God and the governor of all things. So he has some insight, including the Logos is divine agent. We see Philo describing the Logos as both divine and distinct from God, foreshadowing Christian theology. Unlike Plato's idea, which merely orders pre-existing matter, Philo's Logos is the actual means of creation itself. And we have a synthesis of Jewish monotheism and Greek rationalism in Philo, who has this fusion of monotheism with Greek metaphysics and influenced later theological developments. In one place he wrote, the Logos is the high priest who mediates between God and the world, interceding for the mortal race. So he had some good insights and thoughts. Doesn't quite have all of them, but think about what he's doing there. For the most part, he's getting things wrong. Philo's reinterpretation of Genesis 1 aligns with Greek philosophical rationalism. Instead of a direct act of divine speech, creation occurs through the Logos, which embodies divine wisdom and rationality. So he's not thinking of it in terms of messianic ideas. Don't think that he's pre-writing the Gospel of John in a prophetic fashion. He is writing about philosophy, and when John comes around and writes his gospel, he knows about this material. He uses this material to teach messianic principles to a people that are steeped in this kind of philosophical milieus of where they've been blended together and it's all kind of gobbledygooked together. So just make sure you understand the order of that correctly. So conclusion here. Yes, we're actually ending. Last slide. The implications. The study of philosophical creation myths in the classical period reveals a profound transition from mythological to philosophical and theological explanations of creationism. Earlier ideas have been put away as superstition. However, in a sense, they're being maintained in order to maintain traditional order, but they're being put away in thought in favor of rationalism, Romans adaptations in favor of rational, naturalistic concepts. We see Plato's Demiurge to Philo's Logos to John's Gospel. We see a gradual shift from mythical storytelling to structured metaphysical reasoning. I include John's Gospel there as a way to remind us that John is putting a lens on the thinking of the day and using the thinking of that day to explain the truth. So I'm not trying to detract from the Gospel of John. Please understand what I'm trying to do here. So we have the primary idea is that the traditions of the past are being lost, and you see rationalistic ideas replacing the old myths, and you see a new religion rising, and that new religion is that of reason. It will become later known as humanism, and yet we would look at all of that and simply say they're searching for the truth, and the truth has already been here. The truth has already been written, and it's simply that how John begins his gospel. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word, the Logos, is God.